So when I tell you that diversity doesn't mean what we think it means, like let's bring in people with different perspectives, they think that the only different perspectives that could possibly matter are ones rooted in identity. But that's not even good enough. That's not even good enough. We have racial minorities, we have women, we have whatever in this room, and I guarantee you, you're the wrong kind of diversity. You are the wrong kind of diversity because you don't have authentic diversity. Authentic diversity is that which is in line with, that agrees with, that has the sophisticated understanding of the critical theory of identity that's in play. You have to be a critical theorist of identity or you have false consciousness. There's another idea that sort of traces back to Marx. Marx said it once, didn't really buy it, but the critical theory school really loved it. Engels used it a couple of times, wasn't their thing. False consciousness became big under the Frankfurt School, not under Marx, but it did originate there. So you have false consciousness. You have internalized the racist system. You've internalized the patriarchal system. You've internalized the heteronormative and homophobic system. You've internalized cisnormativity and transphobia. You've internalized these myriad words. You've internalized them. And so if you disagree with the critical theory of identity as it applies, you are the wrong kind of diversity. So diversity means hiring critical theorists. That's what diversity means. And if you don't understand that they think in terms of power, you think I'm crazy when I tell you that. I'm not crazy. That's what they mean. Diversity means uniformity of critical theory thought with different colored faces. They need somebody who can give the authentic lived experience of being black, an authentic lived experience of being a black woman, an authentic lived experience of being Latino, an authentic lived experience of being a gay Latino. They need the authentic lived experience where authentic means agrees with critical theory. That's what it means. And you can't possibly believe me until you understand that they think only in terms of systemic power. And we could go into a great deal of detail about how there is much value to identity if we had time and were interested. Sorry, not any diversity. There's much value to diversity. You have this expertise, I have that expertise. You came from the farm, I came from the city. We have different perspectives that bear on something. We can even understand how that can apply sometimes in terms of the experience of being a certain identity group in certain contexts. But those contexts are contextual and fluid and complicated and move through time. That's not how critical theory sees it. It's very straightforward. It's very cut and dry. It's very cartoonish. And if you don't agree, you're the wrong kind of diversity. Inclusion. Inclusion. Sounds great. Let's all be included. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. We don't want to make anybody want to leave. We don't want anybody to feel unwelcome. That's inclusion. Let's include people. Let's not exclude people. What does that look like through a lens that understands the world only in terms of systemic power as related by critical theory where truth doesn't matter? Anything that could be construed as offensive or uncomfortable to any member of a minoritized group, as they use the language to say, is not inclusive. That has to be stricken. So inclusion means speech codes. It means restricted speech. It means not racial sensitivity or sex sensitivity or any of these other kinds of sensitivity. It means a very extreme form in which anybody who could link the thing that was said or done to a system of power, upholding a system of power, has grounds to tell you that what you said or did was inappropriate and your intentions didn't matter. So it means severely restricted speech. It means a totalitarian environment in which the views that are considered right and authentic are the only acceptable ones unless you're asking questions to learn more. So says one of their theorists, Barbara Applebaum, in her 2010 book, Being White, Being Good. I maybe said that wrong. Maybe it's being good, being white. I do it every time. So I don't want to misquote that. It's one or the other. Flip a coin. She argues that the only legitimate way to disagree is to ask questions to understand better. What's another example, though, of something that might make somebody uncomfortable? Well, according to the critical theory that says that we live in a white supremacist hegemony, the presence of whiteness is everywhere, and this exacts a constant toll on the people of color who have to experience living as a person of color in an oppressive white supremacist society. So you have to set up all black spaces where that presence of whiteness isn't there. We call that segregation. They call it desegregation. George Orwell would be proud. Desegregation is segregation, or segregation is desegregation, however you want to have it. So you have to have segregated spaces to help people escape the permanence of the white male gaze. They sometimes phrase it that way. You have to give them safe spaces is the sort of friendly way to put, identity, single identity or mono identity spaces in which they don't have to have the oppression of being around people who their very presence reinforces the experience of hegemonic power. So the point of these critical theories then is to oversensitize people to language so that I might hear somebody say something and I think, an African American might not like that. And then that person's out. That person can't speak. That person has to be silenced. It doesn't matter if a single person ever was offended by it. A good example of that would be master bedrooms. Master bedrooms, we can't have master bedrooms anymore. We have realty businesses dropping the term master bedroom from their websites, from their listings. Why? Because somebody decided that this term, which was invented in a Sears catalog in the 1920s, obviously must refer to slavery, which it didn't. Therefore, it makes me uncomfortable, so we have to get rid of that. So we have to strike even language that, whether it corresponds to reality or not, we have to strike out language that somebody could find offensive, even in theory, as long as you have a critical theorist who's able to figure out that the racism, which must be present somewhere, can be found. Once it's found, it's out. So we have to do that to keep a space inclusive. These arbitrary moving rules create a system in which everybody's afraid to speak all the time because they never know what the wrong thing is that's going to get them in trouble or fired or pilloried on social media, and that's called totalitarianism. And we have to segregate our spaces because social justice, obviously. That's inclusion. And if you don't understand this word in terms of the insane idea that everything boils down to these cartoonish power dynamics that had lots more truth in the past, but not even the degree of truth that they're speaking about now, and almost no truth now. If you don't accept that, you can't understand this. You hear inclusion and you translate it into something more reasonable. You hear diversity and you think, well, it is good to have different kinds of people around. It is good to have that different perspective. Here's this example of something bad that happened when we didn't. So diversity and inclusion install a totalitarian system of thought in which we have to hire the party to micromanage every single thing for us. It is a world in which adult human beings, to say nothing of children, cannot be possibly trusted to talk about identity-related issues or even be in the vicinity of one another across identities, and have to be micromanaged by administrative busybodies who love to go to bureaucratic meetings when you don't, and they can install the policy there. So that's diversity and inclusion. Now we can turn to equity. Equity is not as big of a lie as these other two. Equity kind of tells you what it is. It sounds like a nice word, but if you actually just look up social equity theory, which they've dropped the social so you can't look too easily, it means whereas equality, this is pretty close to a quote, whereas equality means that citizens A and B have equal shares, equity means adjusting the shares so that citizens A and B are made equal. It's equality of outcome, enforced equality of outcome. So in practice, it's going to involve racial quotas, other identity quotas. We see this in practice in California, which has had a law for a little while saying we have to have a female CEO in every company of a certain size. Now that you have to have a racial minority on every C-suite. Sorry, I said CEO. It's on the C-suite of every big company. You now have to have a woman and at least one racial or sexual minority. And this will expand. Quotas are the thing. This is racial quotas and sex quotas and other quotas. It is to enforce equal outcomes. Those equal outcomes are going to be assessed, though, because they have to make up for the cruelties and oppressions of history, the unfairness of history. They will be enforced rather generously in certain directions and rather tightly in others. So in other words, it will be something like affirmative action combined with reparations without ever having to use either word, so they can keep using those words for other things at the same time. Equity doesn't mean equality. Equity means forcing equal outcomes artificially. We've tried this experiment as a society again and again and again and again, and it doesn't work. It never works. It undermines trust in our institutions at the very least. It places people who would be better qualified in certain sectors and in the wrong sectors because they have to meet certain quotas. So rather than helping people flourish to the best of their ability where they would flourish to the best of their ability, you have to stick them like puzzle pieces into places where sometimes it works out great and sometimes they don't belong. And meanwhile, making everything fit this preconceived notion. And so you look at this very, very, even still in a probably very friendly way, you say, oh, well, I don't think that's a great idea, but it doesn't matter under an understanding of systemic racism. By the way, systemic racism means inequity is there. Racial inequity exists. If there are inequities, there must be systemic racism. They're identical concepts, the opposite pieces of one another. And so you think, well, maybe that's fine. Well, if you look at it under a systemic understanding, any cause must be racism. So even if it's a statistical fluctuation, even if the entire applicant pool was pulled through and you couldn't find, and you hired every even minimally qualified person to fill your different boxes, whatever those happen to be, that's still racism. So you see this a lot in organizations. I know it happens in some churches where the most dangerous place to be is close to woke, because they're bending over backwards to make this happen, and they're the ones who get hit the hardest, saying you're not trying hard enough, because they're the ones who are showing that they're going to make that effort. Equity is not equality. Equity probably will not work in any case whatsoever. But when you have this systemic understanding of equity, even random fluctuations would be considered racist. Just that many applicants this year. And it was a totally random stochastic error. Sorry, I'm a mathematician. It happens. Doesn't matter. Just natural variance in the numbers would be enough. So you have to understand then the equity, the point is to undo by artificial means systemic inequality, systemic racism, systemic power. It is the tool to unmake the effects of systemic power, believing that if we just have them unmade, that everything's okay. Diversity and inclusion are the tools that are believed by magic, kind of like with the seizing the means of economic production. Here we seize the means of, I guess, bureaucratic production, but also cultural production. If we just get everybody believing diversity and inclusion, then equity will follow probably, and if it doesn't, we'll adjust the numbers with quotas and things, and everything will come out just fine. This is why you see the Proposition 16 in California right now on the ballot to remove the anti-discrimination language from their state constitution. It is in line with equity. That's the purpose. So we're going to discriminate to get equity. This is what Ibram Kendi, another best-selling author that's peddling this stuff for tens of thousands of dollars a pop now, keeps saying. He says that if anti-discrimination produces inequity, then it's racist. If discrimination produces equity, then it's anti-racist. So we need discrimination, just like Mike said. Now, I don't want to drag this out. You've got an idea now of A, how to analyze these things, and B, what these words, diversity, equity, inclusion, that I'm supposed to talk about mean in practice. The goal I had is for you to be able to understand them and to be able to start doing this analysis for yourself, so you'd stop getting played. The words don't mean what you think they mean. You have to say, how would somebody who obsesses about systemic power all the time mean this word? You have to do that, or you're going to miss it every single time. That said, I do want to say that this is, like all such movements, in a sense I kind of began with Marx. We saw the attempts to force Marxism with that, on the other side of the gulag joke I made. You end up having to start applying force. You end up having to start doing things that are distinctly illiberal, distinctly anti-liberty, anti-freedom, as I said, totalitarian, in order to enforce this. And we're starting to see very openly this kind of agitation. We've seen, for example, in the past, to echo what Mike had said earlier, we can say the very postmodern thing. We've seen people say, oh, we no longer have to worry about true theories and false theories, what was the exact wording? We need strategic theories. We don't have to worry about true theories or false theories, just strategic theories. And now this has progressed far beyond that to where the strategic theories, people are seeing through them, and force becomes necessary. So you have to force segregate spaces. You have to force diversity quotas. You have to force equity. You have to force people to believe, act, and do according to the ideology, or you cancel them. Whiteness is property, so we can burn down a target. Whiteness is property is straight out of critical race theory. Therefore, we can seize it. We can seize that property for ourselves. You want a scary one? We think that the Constitution protects us in all things. We have the Fourth Amendment against illegal search and seizure. We should all acknowledge at the beginning of every meeting that we live on stolen land. Your land was stolen. Your property was stolen in the first place. It's not a violation of the Fourth Amendment to seize stolen property. This ideology subverts the contract that's there. It changes the meanings of the words according to its obsession with systemic power, and it plays us over and over again. And it is turning violent as that is starting to be seen not to work.